Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our workshop today on mail security, standard operating procedures, and risk assessment. My name is TJ Kelly. I'll be the moderator for the day. Our expert panel joining us today is Mr. Will Plummer, our Chief Security Officer. Will is our EOD Secure Program Director and Explosives Expert. Will is a 25-year U.S. Army veteran, commanded multiple special operations units with multiple combat deployments. Will is a certified multifunctional logistician, supported civil authorities on hundreds of full spectrum EOD incidents, and directed VIP support for the last 8 U.S. presidents. Today, Will's going to be talking to us about types of dangerous mail and risks that frontline mailroom folks will see on a day-to-day basis and demonstrate what some of that dangerous mail will look like. Also joining us today is Cody Martin, our Director of Mail Security. Cody served 12 years with the United States Postal Inspection Service. He is a USPIS dangerous mail specialist trained in hazmat response, biohazard response, forensic sampling, suspicious substance screening, IED recognition, the list goes on. Cody co-created the PIS IED program for the national headquarters and trained dangerous mail specialists. He was an investigator on the Shannon Richardson case involving ricin letters sent to President Obama and New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, among many other responses and incidents. And he conducted dangerous mail screening for the NFL, the NBA, and President George W. Bush in retirement. Cody today will be discussing the DHS high-risk industries from the Department of Homeland Security and a guide to assessing risk level provided by Homeland Security and introducing 4 types of standard operating procedure and the key components of each. So those are our subject matter experts for the day. We'll start off with Will. So Will, can you take us through a few of the dangerous mail examples and defining that level of risk that mailroom personnel will see on a day-to-day basis? As an explosives expert, what are you concerned about, and what are some of the mailroom folks likely to see in terms of dangerous mail?
Thank you, RTJ. So most of the mail you'll see today and that is being threatening is small, generally half an inch thick or less, weighs less than 10 ounces. Something to be dropped into the USPS collection bin that you can do with regular stamps. You don't have to present yourself to anybody. There's no chain of custody. It's simply dumping it inside. So smaller, thinner threats are going to show up as a lot of white powder, things that are not authorized out of organization. You'll get those shipped in as well. And I'll show you some examples really quick. All right, so what a normal item should look like when it shows up, it should make sense. All the lines should be straight because 10 pieces of paper in here should look like 10 pieces of paper. All the edges, everything should make sense to the operator. If something abnormal shows up, like a white powder letter, it'll start looking like this. So this is 2,500 milligrams of powder that will end up inside of a larger packet that's meant to get after a facility, usually sent in to where it doesn't make a difference who opens it up. Somebody's going to get exposed, and everybody that's in the area is going to have to get decontaminated. So that is simply small amounts of powder. 2,500 milligrams or so is about the average. This could be anything from ricin to hoax powders, hoax events, but has to be handled as the worst case no matter what. Smaller amounts of powder, when these show up, they're generally aimed at an individual. So a CEO, a CFO, your company has laid off a lot of people, somebody in the HR department. So when those show up, generally you're not going to feel anything out of normal. Everything makes sense. Lines are straight, but you start seeing things that are gummed up in the corners. So this is 75 milligrams of powder. That's not something to be easily found. Something you really have to do a good physical and tactile screening with to identify that threat. Liquids. Liquids are common for several reasons. You could put incendiary threats inside of packages. You could put drugs inside of packages. But when they show up, they're pretty clear and pretty straightforward that, yep, you're looking at a liquid. Right? It's something that you can feel generally when you're doing a physical and tactile inspection, but it'll feel a little heavier as well. Since water's denser than whatever else you have in the package, it should feel a little bit heavy. When you start looking at things that can be considered dangerous, IEDs or something of that sort, you look for things that don't make sense. Wires going nowhere, feeling things that necessarily look or don't necessarily feel or look right. So those items, when you start taking a good look at them, they should stand out as being blatantly not appropriate for what you're doing in the facility. And generally we'll follow the rules of the USPS Post Rating 7 that tells you generally what the key indicators to look for are.
Excellent, Will. And so you're seeing the most common incidents in most of these mailrooms are going to be what? I imagine there's not a ton of pipe bombs. Those make the news when they happen, but what are the most common examples that we're seeing?
There's been 2 detonations in mail in the last 60 days. One was at a post office in California and one was in a home in Baltimore, Maryland. Those 2 are the oddballs. Most of the time it's white powder events. It's small illicit items in packages. It's drugs or somebody trying to make it look like some other threat, a hoax. That's the most common threat that you'll see inside of the mailroom.
And each of those has the capacity, I imagine, to shut down a mailroom, shut down a facility, land a company in the news cycle, that sort of thing.
And that's the big 3 things that you got to pay attention for. 1, if it's going to jump up and bite you, life, limb, and property, something that's going to really do damage. 2, if it's going to cause a shutdown, loss of money. And 3, you want to protect brand notoriety and make sure that you're not getting decontaminated in the middle of the parking lot with the news crews watching for no reason.
Understood. Excellent. I'm sure we'll have a few questions about that. For all of our attendees, thank you all for joining us again. If you do have any questions for Will or for Cody as we go through, please feel free to throw those into the chat. We'll get to those at a few different spots throughout today's webinar. So let's throw it now over to Cody and take us through some of the security documentation that organizations, companies can use to help institute a process to detect these threats and deal with them if they arise in your facility.
All right, thanks, Will. Thanks, TJ. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. We're going to take a little bit of your time and talk about mailroom security, right? What does that look like? How do we set policies and procedures in place to work through these types of problems? All the way from how does it look administratively, all the way up through an emergency response. So the idea of this is we're cramming a lot of material into, about 50 minutes. So we're going to try to do the best we can. Normally we spread these out over several weeks and spend quite a bit of time working with clients on SOPs, but I'm going to give you the framework and we'll talk about a few specifics and then you guys can fill in the rest as you see fit at a later date. So that's kind of how it's going to work. We're going to have a few pauses just for questions. So make sure you submit those via the chat and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Also, feel free to take notes while we're going through this. We're going to turn over the entire deck as well as some detailed notes for you, but if there's particulars that really stand out to you that you want to make note of, feel free to take notes on that as we're working through the process. So here's kind of what the building blocks of the program should look like. This is kind of the framework that we're going to use for today's discussion. When you look at a comprehensive mail security program, you start with a policy statement, you work through your processes, you look at how you screen items, you look at maybe executive protection or close protection roles. You look at screening suspicious items specifically, like how does that process work? And that culminates a lot of times in emergency response. So those are the things that we're going to work through today on an individual level. Keep in mind that when we're doing this, you may look at it from 2 different vantage points, right? You may look at it for one policy covering a bunch of different locations, corporate wide. You may be looking at it to fulfill a very specific role. So keep that in mind if you're talking about one location, one specific role, maybe it's an EP role, things like that. Or if you're looking at a corporate application, like a global setting, you want to frame it when you're working, excuse me, through that process. Also, what we can do and what we recommend, and you can see this highlighted over here on the right side, is that if you have a corporate policy set up, right, we can set some standards that apply globally. And then we can build out specific information for specific sites if you want to have enhanced screening at particular locations. So that is one caveat to building this thing out. So we'll build a framework that applies globally to fit whatever your objective is. And then if there's any specifics, if you have one location that needs a little bit more enhanced screening, you can always put that as an attachment in the appendix, and those provisions apply to that location only. So that's kind of how we're going to work through this and how we're going to proceed through the rest of this documentation. So one of the things to remember before we get into building out SOPs, right? We're writing a policy, we're writing procedures in response to something. So what are we responding to? Well, in order for that to make sense internally, right? In order for those processes to work, you are going to have to do a risk assessment. Now, there's some good and bad with that, right? Risk assessments are very subjective a lot of times. They do take time to do, but they're very valuable in a sense that you can't address a threat if you don't know what it is, the extent of it, the probability of it, and what that risk entails. So to take some of the guesswork out of it, DHS has provided some guidelines for us in terms of what constitutes a high-risk industry. And this is in particular to mail screening and mail-borne threats. So you can look at the list here. These are industries that DHS has said, hey, if you fall under the umbrella of any one of these industries, no matter the capacity, you automatically are high risk. So what that entails is that brings in a whole multitude of items and threats that you should be screening for, which we're going to discuss in a little bit. So keep that in mind, right? If you fall under any one of these, no matter how loose of an affiliation it is, DHS says, hey, you're high risk, you should probably adhere to these standards. So, one of the examples I like to look at is let's look at the legal, sector, right? If maybe you're a civil rights attorney who has worked some high profile cases recently, you've been in the media a lot, previously you haven't had that much attention, you've never had an issue, but now due to the kind of work you've been doing, due to the media attention you're exposed to, you may consider yourself high risk all of a sudden, right? So that would be like maybe something on the lower end, all the way up through, say, the Department of Justice and different entities within that branch of the government. So look at those things, see if you fit into any of these, and if you do, hey, great, you're high risk. Great in the sense that you know how to go about moving through the rest of this document. If you do not fit into one of these, that's okay. We're going to expose you to a few things that you can use to work through and figure out what this risk assessment should look like and how that would apply to you in terms of your risk. Some additional considerations that you want to consider are symbolism, location, population. So, if your organization represents something, it's symbolic. It's an entity that if it's attacked, it can have a trickle-down effect on society as a whole. You're going to be high risk, right? So think about the U.S. Postal Service after the anthrax attacks in 2001. There was a negative psychological impact that followed that, right? My grandma, living out in a rural area in Central Texas, thought that she was receiving anthrax in the mail, right? There was no threat of her ever receiving anthrax. She was not a target. Nobody knows who she is. But due to the publicity of that event, right, USPS was used to carry out an attack. It wasn't an attack on the Postal Service in particular, but it had a trickle-down effect, right? So if you're a symbolic industry, company, et cetera, be mindful of that. Again, location, large multi-tenant facilities, large urban centers, these types of things. Population, so if you have an organization with large amounts of employees, that puts you at higher risk. If you are located in an area that's higher density, you can also be at a higher risk regardless of employee size. So just think about these things that are kind of on the peripheral that affect your risk level as well. And as you're going through those, it's kind of, sometimes it's the totality of circumstances, right? Nothing really elevates to that high risk individually, but when you look at it all together, it puts you up to that level. So there's some intangibles that we want to look at as well when we're thinking of doing our risk assessment. So previous terrorist attacks, that's something that most organizations have not been exposed to, right? But when you're talking about maybe the city you live in has been, has come to that in the past. Maybe you're looking at things such as just previous dangerous mailings, previous hoaxes, previous, white powder incidents. All of these types of things add up to creating some intangibles that really can affect your risk factor. Negative press, things like that's going to happen if there have been boycotts or demonstrations or labor disputes. Have you laid off 1,000 employees and now all of a sudden, you're at higher risk because, somebody wants to strike back. You need to consider those things as well. Now there's, outside of these intangibles, there's one kind of final set of things you want to look at, which are some additional considerations in terms of facility layout, tenants, access, loading dock configuration, all of these things, right? So think of, for instance, if you're in a multi-tenant facility or a building, you may be low risk, but the tenant immediately above you or below you, they may be high risk due to the sector that they work in or various other things. So if they are high risk, maybe you guys have a shared mailroom, they could have threats coming in that could there can be collateral damage, there can be some cross contamination onto mail pieces entering your level of the building, things like that. So keep those types of things in mind as you're working through this. And as we'll discuss later, you can always reach out after the fact, and I can help you work through some of those assessments as well. One of the things that we're going to send you guys after this is all over with, and you can look up on your own, is this document from DHS talking about the best practices for mail screening and what those things look like. One of the things that's included in there is a mail center assessment worksheet, and it's going to help you kind of go through a lot of this information. You can simply print it out, get whatever involved employees internally that needs to, be in on the decisions, and just simply work through this document, right? And fill it out the best of your ability. And then when you get to the end, you can kind of take that, look at all the responses, and figure out where you fall on as it relates to risk level. And generally, we classify it just on 3 levels, low risk, medium risk, high risk, and that's kind of how we differentiate between different classifications of risk. But that's what we recommend doing. Try not to overcomplicate it, right? Work with the folks who have done physical security for the rest of your facility, and try to come up with a plan that's pretty comprehensive. If you ever find yourself falling kind of in the middle, between 2 levels, I always say you should probably just err on the side of caution, right? And bump that up to the next risk level just to be safe. So keep that in mind. One of the things you're going to see in this DHS document is mail center classifications and requirement ratings. And this can look a little confusing. It can be a little confusing, to be honest, starting out, but you really don't have to think about it that much. Once you get your risk rating, you can take a look at this small graph on the top left, and it's level 1, 2, and 3, just like we discussed. If you fall under any of the high risk sectors, you're automatically high risk, which would be a level 3. And you can bypass all of this, simply drop down here. You can see in this red box, DHS recommends that you do visual screening, contraband screening, hoax, explosive, chemical, biological, radiological, content, etc. If you're high risk, DHS says, hey, you should be screening all of these things if at all possible, just due to the nature of your business. Now, if you're in a level 1 or 2 and you've made that determination, that's when things get a little bit trickier on here, but it's still not too bad. Let's say you have a satellite office, right? You're in a low risk industry you never receive any media attention. You've never had any threats in the past. And, you've got a small office in a small town, and there's maybe 5 or 6 employees in a small mailroom, right? You've determined your risk level's low. So you're going to take this one. You're going to go over here and look at the mail center size, and you can base that on volume or employee size, et cetera. And we said, hey, you got less than 10 employees. You've got 5 employees there. You receive 50 pieces of mail a day. That would put you at a 1A. So 1A, simply go down to this chart. What does DHS say? Hey, you should do visual screening, contraband, and hoax screening. That's the 3 things you should be looking at a minimum at a facility of that nature. So we're going to send this all to you, and you can use this to kind of work through your locations. Sometimes it comes in handy when you're trying to sell certain processes or procedures to internal folks to get buy-in, just being able to present them a kind of a neutral, non-biased source of information as you're going through these things. So we'll provide that to you at the end as well. So the first thing that we're going to start with is a policy statement, right? So we've looked at all of our locations. We've done our risk assessment. We've determined out what level of risk we are. And now we're ready to start working on our policies and procedures that are a response to that work. So the first thing we want to start with is our policy, because that sets the framework. That sets the tone for this entire document. What I've done here is included 3 examples, if you will. You can see option 1, 2, and 3, just to get your mind thinking of what your policy statement should look like. And this is going to be like a 3 or 4 sentence, very simple paragraph that it doesn't go into detail, but it addresses who and what and how you're going to attack mail screening. Option 1 would be kind of like a broad corporate level, all sites, all personnel are getting the same level of treatment, right? And you can see here, all mail gets a visual and tactile inspection, verified chain of custody. That's the minimum base level type stuff that we're going to look at. We're going to have some third-party experts to support us if it gets to that level where we can't clear something on our own. And that's how it's going to read, right? It's going to be super simple, and that's what it's going to address. Option 2 is something that might be a little more relevant to high-risk sites. So in this one, it would read, the high-risk locations will have a formal mail screening program to include, visual, tactile inspections, verification of chain of custody, and we are going to incorporate some sort of screening technology where we can image packages and letter mail to add that additional level of security. High-risk locations are going to include all this. And then you would annotate, low-risk locations will not. They're just going to receive possibly the visual and tactile and chain of custody inspections, and we're going to be good. That's how it would apply for maybe a higher risk site. Now you have the option 3, which is something that addresses potentially just your executives or your head office folks, or possibly even something for an EP. So this one would read, something like all executives and head office personnel will have a formal mail screening. We're going to annotate what that means. So, hey, it's going to include visual and tactile inspections, chain of custody, technology screening, etc. We're going to highlight what that technology is. And then we're going to go on to say other locations and employees will rely on visual and tactile inspection, and that's the extent of their mail screening program. As you can see, these vary. They have some overlapping information, but they vary, slightly depending on what the overall objective is. So that's what I want you to keep in mind on this portion, right? Think about what you want to do, what the mail screening, who it's going to apply to, or where it's going to apply, and then think about what level of screening that you want to apply to that person or location. And that's simply all you're going to summarize in this. You'll see 2 bullets down here on the bottom. I included those down here because those fit with all 3 options. So as you're writing this out, you can say, this global mail screening policy covers all personnel and facilities who receive, screen, and or deliver mail. Then you would go into that description and it lists out who and what and how. And then we would conclude that with consistent with, XYZ companies, global mail screening, security programs and standards, all of these recommendations apply, something to that nature, right? So that's kind of what we would, how we would frame that paragraph before moving on through the rest of the document. So be sure to keep your site's risk levels in mind as they relate to this policy statement, and because that's really what you're writing it in response to. And that is the policy statement. So when you're looking at this and you're setting up your processes and your mail flow, and this is a good place to kind of inject this into the conversation. We need to look at, before we can determine how you need to process your mail and what procedures you need to follow, we need to look at your mail volume. So we do this for a couple of reasons, but first I'll kind of define what it looks like, right? We have low throughput and high throughput as kind of our 2 main options here. And we simply describe it as low throughput, something that's receiving 1,000 pieces of mail per day or less. High throughput would be anything over that. Executive protection work's typically going to be much lower volume of mail, but it has some very unique circumstances and dynamics surrounding it that are due to kind of that fluid nature of the work. So there's unique requirements that fall into that category, and we'll discuss those a little bit more later. But for the purpose of setting up just an organizational mail flow, look at low throughput, high throughput, and look at those numbers and kind of figure out where you fall, okay? And the best guess is all we're looking for at this point. Once you figure out where you fall in here, you can start working on your processes in terms of if it's say it's less than 1,000 mail pieces per day, that is a low enough volume where you can put one set of mail standards in place in terms of screening. You can work right through those. All mail gets the same, it gets subjected to the same amount of screening procedures, and you should be good to go. Once you get over that 1,000 mail piece number, give or take, you more than likely will have to work on a couple of different flows for your mail just to maintain efficiency, right? We can't have 10,000 mail pieces a day and efficiently work through that, screening it with every type of piece of equipment that we have. So on something like that, we may look at known mailings, things that have a verified chain of custody, and they're going to go through less scrutiny. So if you've got a box of staplers that have come in, you know who the vendor is, you know it's supposed to be arriving that day, it comes in, you don't have to screen that like you would a letter that has some eccentric writing on it, right? So use a little common sense here, and you can split up mail accordingly. and kind of differentiate what receives the high level of screening and a lower level of screening, and you can maintain your efficiency that way. When we start looking at mail process flow, there's a few things that we need to look at in terms of process and procedure, and how things come into the organization and then how they get dispersed. And it's kind of that meat in the middle that we have to spend a little bit of time on and figure out how we want it to look and in what direction we want it to go, things of that nature. As you can see here, the very first thing is going to be offloading and inspection. So this is talking about when something arrives on site. Typically, most often we see mail incoming to organizations from a bunch of different avenues. UPS, FedEx may come in one way, USPS may come in another way, private couriers may come in another way, and they all get different levels of screening and scrutiny. What we want to do at this initial offloading and inspection portion, which is the very first step in the process, is to consolidate that if we can, right? So we want to make sure that we can get things consolidated into one location where it receives the same amount of scrutiny. Everything is brought together. We can give it a quick visual on the front end, right, where we can determine if there's any sort of suspicious substances that are quick to detect. We can look at our mail transfer route. How does it get to the screening room? We can look at what our visual and tactile inspection looks like. We can interject technology screening if we're at that level, and then it culminates right in distribution or pickup. And those are the things that we want to look at. Those are the orders that we want to go in when we're working this out and building out these procedures. Let's see here. Let me just elaborate on this. I think we have just a couple of minutes. So when we're talking about mail transfer route, what we want to do there is look at the point of reception. Where does the mail come in, and where is it going to be screened? And what does the process look like getting the mail from the point of reception to where it is going to get screened? Who are you going to be exposing to potential threats? What infrastructure is going to be exposed to potential threats? Ideally, what we want to do here is minimize the amount of distance traveled from point A to point B, but that's not always possible, right? So if you're picking up the mail on the back dock, the quickest route to the screening room is through cubicle farm. We want to avoid that, right? So we're going to have to maybe take a little bit longer route, but it's going to be a little bit more secure, expose less people to potential contamination, those types of things. Going along with that, if you receive something, packages frequently, et cetera, and you typically go through an area that may expose them or get them in close proximity to some critical infrastructure, servers, things of that nature, you want to keep that in mind as well. Just due to things that have, threats that have popped up in the last year or so, like war shipping, where people are using devices to compromise your systems internally. Again, we want to avoid that if possible. So think a little bit about your route planning, how you want your mail to go from the point of reception to the point of screening, and plan that accordingly and try to avoid any sort of contamination or threat exposure to people or infrastructure along the route. Again, this visual and tactile inspection, that's what we like to highlight. Typically, I say we do that at multiple points in the process. There should be a quick visual inspection here at this first key element, which is the offloading and inspection, right? And we're just looking for obvious things. And if you catch something there, it never enters the organization. It can get screened on the back dock. If first responders are necessary, they can show up and handle everything externally. It may prevent an evacuation, things of that nature. Then we go through our mail transfer route. We wind up in the screening room, and we're going to do a more thorough visual and tactile inspection, right? So we're interjecting it into the process at this point. This may be a moment in time where you're just doing sorting. So you're high volume, and you're going to have to sort, high threat versus low threat mail. And you're just giving everything a quick look. You're making sure that nothing stands out on the outside. You're making sure nothing feels awkward. And it goes on through the process as you're sorting it, right? So you're giving it that quick look. You're making sure you're checking chain of custody. And then we're going to go ahead and screen it using technology if you have that in place. So you're going to do your imaging at this point, especially if you catch something, right? If you're low volume, you may image everything. And you can do your visual and tactile in the machine. Say, for instance, you're using the MailSecur device. You can do your visual and tactile in the viewing area, and you're getting those cues as well as the image that you're looking at through the technology. So once you finish this process, you're either going to distribute the mail internally, however you do that, or you're going to, have it cleared for pickup. And that culminates kind of that process flow. And this is the things that you're outlining in SOP number 1. So you want to make sure and you just detail those, make sure there are some guidelines in place that, direct people to do it in a particular order, in a particular flow. And, this is one of those where you can be a little more detailed in this process here, especially if you're talking about one location. If you're talking about one location, you can detail it out. The process should not change. Be very specific. If you're talking about applying this globally to a bunch of locations and they have different looking mail rooms and things of that nature, you may want to keep it a little more broad, right? So we're writing these to apply across the organization. You can keep them a little more generic, and then you can address specific sites in the appendix at a later date. Just something to think about.
So Cody, that seems like a decent spot to pause for questions here. We have had a few come in through the chat, so thank you very much to everybody who has submitted the questions. Many of the questions are not directly related to the SOP process yet. I expect we'll get a few of those as we go through some of these. So for those who have submitted questions in the chat, again, thank you. We're going to hold those for a little bit later. We have a Q&A section toward the end, so we'll get to those. Some are answered in the chat, some will be answered live. But if anybody has any questions so far on the material Cody is asking about and kind of going over for us, please feel free to submit those. Cody, is there anything that, the typical questions that you will get when we go through this in a more formal process where people are confused on that, or is this fairly well straightforward and we hop into the next thing? What sorts of questions do you typically get here?
Yeah, SOP number 1's pretty standard in terms of just outlining what the flow is going to look like. A lot of the questions typically have to do with threat levels and threat assessment, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning, but that's where there's usually a little bit of confusion. And, the main thing there is to just make sure it's thorough. We live in a world where physical security is taken very seriously, and a lot of organizations, have outstanding physical security, but a mail piece can come in through the back dock and go right up to the CEO's desk and never be exposed to any sort of screening whatsoever. So that's just the problem that we're trying to address here. So make sure you're really thorough with the threat assessment, and the rest of the SOP number 1 kind of falls into place right behind that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So no other questions come into the chat so far. So we can move on to SOP number 1. I stand corrected. Here comes one. Should the mail screening location be self-contained, air intake separate from the main building? I imagine that question related to things like CBR&E threats, white powders, that sort of thing. That's a great question. And we certainly do want to hear an answer to it. Is now the time for that, or should we push that to later in the process and come back around to this question?
We can hit it real quick. Yes, the answer is yes on that. The more thought and work and effort you can put into your mail screening location, the better. Most locations, they don't have the luxury to have an isolated mail screening room that has its own standalone ventilation and things of that nature, right? Much less a standalone screening facility that sits outside of the main building. A few people do, and they're really lucky because you can really build out a thorough, comprehensive screening program there. Most organizations have to deal with the space that they have available. Just keep in mind, you don't necessarily want to be screening your mail, in areas that expose other people, or maybe even adjoining walls, or you don't want the CEO sitting right on top of the mail screening room, things like that. So it may take a little work, but if you can even shift things around internally and just to kind of isolate the screening room by itself, ideally as close to the receiving area as possible, right, to minimize that transfer route. But those are some of the things that you can look at. But to answer your question, yes, all those things would be great in the perfect world. And if you can do that, absolutely you should, if your risk level warrants it. But for most people, you're kind of having to work with what you have at the moment. And that's one of the things that we really look at when we're building these out for clients is what's the current infrastructure look like, and how can we best optimize that for the screening level that they need, particular to their situation.
Understood. Okay. We do have a few more questions coming in here. At this point, I think I'd like to hold these for our Q&A section at the end. So I will come back around, make sure we have these. But I think, for time, let's move on to our next section and we'll come back to these questions.
Okay. Sounds good. So what we're looking at here is some of the things that we're going to be addressing for key threats. So we've outlined our process. We know what steps we're going to take to interact with the mail as it comes in, as it works its way through the facility, and as it gets to the distribution point. What are we going to look at in terms of key threat indicators? So this is not an all-inclusive list, right? But these are some things that if you've never been exposed to dangerous mail, if you've never had to work in a screening capacity, these are the things that we see a lot of times, not all the time, right? It's not all-inclusive, but these are very obvious indicators that somebody could pick up very easily. And as Will, not to steal his thunder, right? But one of the things he always says is, hey, humans are very good at change detection. So as you screen mail, the more mail you screen, you're going to know what normal looks like. You're going to know what's expected. You're going to know how things look as they come into your organization. And when things look outside of that, when things stand out, just those little nuances, those little details, those are the kind of things that should alert your attention and kind of lead you to that next step in the process. So you want to make sure that these are annotated in your SOPs, just so people have an idea of what to look for. Gets the brain juices flowing, and has them work towards thinking about how creative could a bad guy get when they're trying to introduce something into your facility, right? So, looking at weight and stains and excessive postage, and addressing something to just the CEO instead of a person's name and things like that, right? Those are all very obvious indicators. But again, you want to highlight those. You want to make sure people are aware of those. And a good place is to stick those in the document right after that first SOP before you get into interacting with particular suspicious mail pieces. Kind of as an addendum to SOP number 1 would be what I call SOP 1A, because it's really just kind of a alternative to the first SOP as it relates to your objective. So this would be more related to specific executive protection work. If you're doing close protection, or if you're working at or in a scenario where you do not have a designated mail screening room, you're going to have to build some provisions into your SOPs to accommodate that, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about next. And I think we should probably just go right into that one, TJ, unless there's some questions that have popped up.
Again, there are several questions that have coming in. So again, thank you everybody for asking all these. I think the questions will pull us in a slightly different direction. So okay. I think it makes sense to keep going. And we do have, a substantial list to get through of these questions when we come back around. So there'll be plenty of time to go over all of these in detail. So in the meantime, I think continuing on makes some sense here.
All right. Yeah. Let me just move on through this then. So like I said, the purpose of this is to address EP type scenarios in particular, right? The 4 stages or the 4 levels that we're going to look at are the same in terms of the mail receiving area, the transfer route, screening operations, and then how the mail is distributed. But the details surrounding them in particular are going to look a lot different as it relates to EP type work. I've highlighted one level of this. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time blowing out this section because we still have to talk about suspicious items and then also emergency response. But think about just related to a designated mail receiving area. If you're in the EP world, that could be the back of an SUV. If you go pick up all the mail for, the protectee, then maybe they have a PO box, right? And you go to the post office and you pick up everything there every day. Well, that's your designated mail receiving area. It could be the back of an SUV, right? So at that point, you're in a vehicle with items that potentially contain or house a threat. So it could be a security room, a guard shack, checkpoint, garage, any other type of location. These things can change weekly. Maybe not so much due to the pandemic, but in a normal functioning world, right? There's a lot of travel and things of that nature that surround executives due to the nature of their work. They may be receiving types, mail all over the place. Could be the residents, et cetera. Keep that in mind. Build these out a little more generic. You do not want to tie an EP team down, with administrative items that really, they kind of, the works is very fluid and very dynamic. So you can't you can't hog tie them, as we say down here, right, to a particular procedure if those things are going to affect their work. So they have an objective in mind. They need to be able to function within that, but some thought needs to go into how you're going to receive mail. What does that transfer route look like? You don't want unscreened mail in the back of an SUV. If you are taking the dignitary somewhere, you don't want them in the same vehicle with that, right? So you have to think about these things, build these out in a way that makes sense for your EP folks, keeping that fluid nature of the work in mind, and then kind of work your way through the rest of these levels of the screening process. So we should probably go ahead. Let's go ahead and hop into number 2, TJ, if you don't mind. And I know there's a couple of questions related to the EP stuff, but I have those tabled for the end because we'll address those kind of as a whole when we're talking about emergency response. And then that way it'll save us some time here to hit all the questions, and we'll be sure to cover those. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into suspicious package screening real quick. We're at the point now where we have gone through our process and maybe we've identified a suspicious package. We haven't validated anything yet, but what do we do? How do we outline these in the SOPs? So you can see there the four areas we're going to work through. So how to validate it as being suspicious or not. How do we make the situation safer? So how are we going to render safe that situation? How do we de-escalate if we need to? So we think we have something, people are getting a little bit worked up. Okay, we don't. What do we need to do to bring everything back down? And then what are we going to do if we have to move into an emergency response? And that's always the big one. You know, when and what do we do if there is an emergency? And we're going to address all of these. So looking at validating a suspicious item, the best thing that I can say, and a lot of times it doesn't, you know, it seems to be a kind of a cop-out answer, but you're going to use your best judgment, right? If something doesn't look right, give it some additional screening. So you're going to throw some additional screening at it. You maybe toss it aside, finish processing the rest of that stuff, and then go in and do some enhanced screening on just that one item. One of the things that we recommend, and we'll hit on this earlier, is Poster 84. And that's a publication put out by the U.S. Postal Service in conjunction with the inspection service that just gives a visual example of what a suspicious package and suspicious letter looks like. It has a lot of the characteristics that we should be looking for annotated on there. We recommend just throwing one of these up in the mailroom. A lot of people have them already, but if you don't, you should get one. And I think we actually include one of those in the attachments we send over. But it's a visual reminder that keeps people thinking about the things to look for and you know, how they could come into an organization. And we want that on the back of their mind as they start to get kind of complacent with the screening, if that happens. So we want to look for these suspicious characteristics. We want to make sure that if anything stands out, it gets additional screening. And then if it does, you know, we have something that looks, you know, it's going to so-and-so in HR, give them a call. Hey, are you expecting this item? It has weird writing on it. It has this. Oh yeah, I ordered that as a Christmas present. I didn't want it going to the house. I had it sent up here to the office. No big deal, right? You can clear it that way. It happens all the time. Nothing wrong with that. So feel free to reach out to the addressee to try to clear those things ahead of time before it escalates into something that it shouldn't be. Rendering the situation safe. So the idea here is we want to, you know, we want to preserve safety and infrastructure to the extent possible that if something does end up being there, right, we're trying to minimize those effects. So we don't know. We're going through the confirmation phase. We have no idea what's going on. What steps are we going to take to kind of make that situation safer for those around? So for instance, if, you know, it seems silly, if you are screening mail and you have something that's emitting white powder and you get it on your hands, you should not walk through the office asking your coworkers, hey, what do you think this is, right? That is a bad idea. So thinking through things like that, placing the item down, containing it, shutting down access to that room, going through basic decontamination efforts, things like that are going to be paramount. You're going to have a way to notify other folks, hey, stay away from this area. So think about internal communication. How are you going to broadcast that message? Do you have an internal alert system? Is it something you would even want to put over like a PA? Is it simple where you can just walk, you know, somebody can say, hey, don't go in there, and you can lock it, and maybe it's access controlled, things like that. So think about how you can make that situation safe until it's resolved. If it's not a suspicious item, how are you going to de-escalate that? So one of the things you can do is that third-party outreach. You know, like with a lot of vendors, and ours in particular, there's EOD support. You can reach back to like the EOD Secure guys. They will take a look at your images. They'll walk you through what's going on. They can give you expert advice on what you have, if it's a threat or not a threat, and it can advise you on what to do. So reaching out to third-party experts to help you through that process can be valuable as well. One of the other things to do is just working through your chain of command. So you should have an emergency card on site. You should be able to work through that thing and get other folks' advice internally on what they think you have, right? So if you've got a mail screener, they will have a supervisor at some level that they should be able to reach out to, because you don't want that person initiate an emergency response on their own unchecked. So if there's a time and opportunity for that, we want to make sure that you reach out to those folks. And that leads us right into the emergency response, right? So getting those additional reviews, getting that internal support, coordinating that through your corporate security folks inside, going through that chain of command, making sure everybody's on the same page. And if there's a conclusion that's drawn that, hey, we need to bring in outside folks in the form of first responders, then it happens at that point, right? So we like to see a few layers in between the screener and who actually makes that call. And that's one of the things that you're going to highlight in that process as well. And make sure it's annotated out, make sure it's reflected on that emergency response card that's in the screening room so they know who to work through. And you should be good to go in terms of working up to the emergency response. And that's when things get a little bit dicey sometimes. So that's how you would get there. And then of course, everything else comes after the fact as it relates to emergency response. Any questions, TJ, that's come in on that portion?
Again, several, and thank you to everyone who's submitting all these questions. But again, they'll sort of take us off topic a little bit with questions about the Postal Service and their inspection levels and that sort of thing. So I do want to get to all of those. Will has been answering a few live in the chat, so thank you for your help on that, Will. But Cody, I think it's best to finish out our last SOP, and then we'll come back to address all of these questions we've gotten so far.
Okay, let's hop right into emergency response then. So this is basically where you're going to outline the emergency response, and I would say that this is the most important one, but they're all important, right? Because they build upon one another. And if you don't work through those first few methodically, you can arrive at this portion in a premature manner, and you can initiate things that you can't take back once those wheels start turning, and it's going to cause some disruptions and things of that nature. So we're going to talk about how we initiate emergency response, and then kind of how we should react and interact with first responders once they arrive on scene. So I've got highlighted over here again, these 4 categories. Starts with evacuation. And it would seem like this would be last, but the reason I put it there is that you should build in, and this is my advice, you should build in a provision that says, hey, at any point, if you are having a physical or adverse reaction to a mail piece, right, you should probably take steps to address that immediately. So if you're screening mail and maybe some sort of vapor is coming out and you're having a hard time breathing and your eyes are burning and things like that, right? You should probably go ahead and escalate that to the next level. And there should be some provisions built in to address those things. So, if it's your skin's burning, if you have adverse physical reaction, if it's smoking, there's vapors coming out, if there's an obvious threat there, go ahead and initiate that next level emergency response and get that out of the way. Highlight that in this section. Detail it out as much as you want to internally. And then once that's done, you can say, hey, immediate evacuation if these things are present. If not, proceed through the rest of this document, as you would work through it in kind of more of a methodical manner. So again, like I said, evacuations, physical reactions, smoke, vapor, fumes, any threatening substance, go ahead and take care of business that way. If not, then work through steps 2, 3, and 4. As I highlighted earlier, communication with the security teams paramount. We want to make sure we go through the chain of command. You're going to have to relay pertinent data. This is where we see a breakdown sometimes. The screener has all this information. They've taken all this in. They know what's suspicious. They've got all this info. They call their supervisor, who maybe goes to somebody else, and that person calls first responders. Does the person making the call have all the information needed to pass along to first responders? You need to think about how that information is transferred from the screener to the person making the call and make sure that's addressed in this document. So pertinent information has to be relayed to first responders if they're called. and be able to just talk through, hey, why was this item, why couldn't you render it safe? What is going on there that stands out? What's suspicious? What particulars? And then that's what you're going to annotate to them. So postmarks and addressee and sender information, barcode information, weight, felt lopsided, like all of these things, right? We're gonna send that over to them. If you have images from technology screening, excellent, right? As Will can attest to, and he may speak on later, if it does rise to the level of an explosive threat and a bomb tech has to come in there, we want to minimize the amount of collateral damage from a disruption or a render safe procedure, right? So don't give Will an excuse to blow something up, or he will. So we want to minimize that if we can. So the more information we can give them, the better the response is going to be. We're going to be able to maintain more evidence and things of that nature. When it talks about communication to the security team, and we hit on this a little bit ago, we always want to leave the decision to call first responders with the designated person within the organization. Even if you're reaching out to third-party support, say you call up Will's group and they say, hey, we recommend you call first responders on this, right? It's your decision ultimately. You're going to make that call, so keep that in mind. There should be a person that makes that decision, and in light of them being gone, there should be designees in place, right? There should be somebody highlighted, annotated, specifically who's going to make that call. Put that in here and you'll be good to go. Risk mitigation, again, we're talking about good faith efforts to reduce risk. We're not going to expose people who don't need to be. We don't need to call in our buddy from the next department over to come take a look at the device to see what he thinks, right? We don't need to do those types of things. We want to maintain access on the room, make sure nobody gets into that. We want to pass along good information. We want to minimize exposure to employees and facilities. We want to do all of these things, and that's kind of where you build this in, just kind of basic protocols and things to do to mitigate that risk until first responders do show up and they can give you some better direction. And then, of course, it culminates in calling first responders. And what does that look like? Well, there's a lot of entities that may respond or could respond to an incident. You know, throughout my career, you know, I've seen it all, right? From just the simple response where I would go out as a U.S. Postal Inspector, I would get a call at a facility or an organization or you know, some office within the government or a residence, and I would show up. I would take my gear in there. I would screen the item. I would figure out what it is, what the threat is, and handle it from that point. I've seen that all the way up to every local, state, and federal agency on scene. There's lights and sirens, and they've got, you know, there's blocks of an urban area that have been isolated, and we had just chaos going on, right? So there's all kinds of responses from one to the other. What you want to make sure is that you're controlling that to the best of your ability. Be sure to call the appropriate people to respond to the appropriate threat that's going on. And I say that, and I'll explain that to this. If you have an item that you just simply don't feel good about, it looks suspicious, hey, that's good enough. You guys can't clear it. If there's no immediate threat, right? If there's no immediate threat, it may not justify calling 911 and getting a full hazmat response. You tell them, it looks like I've got some technology. It looks like there's some powder in here, or there's a little powder on the exterior of the envelope. You don't necessarily want to get a full-blown, you know, hazmat response, or you may, right? You got to make that decision. But keep in mind, like a postal inspector response is going to look much different than a hazmat response. So you want to pick the appropriate entity to respond to your situation. And a lot of that has to deal with the type of threat it is, the immediate nature of the threat, and some of those particulars like that. So just keep that in mind. When you do make that call, be sure that you pass along all the pertinent information. One of the critical things that we always struggled with too is, you know, come to XYZ Corporation. Well, it's a 20-story building and they just give us the address and we show up and we're like, where do we go, right? We don't know what floor this thing's on. We don't know where the item's at. So be sure to pass along all these specifics. If you need to have somebody outside, maybe your protocols say, hey, if first responders are called, X person is going to go out front, wait for them, and walk them into the specific area they need to go. Little things like that can make a big difference, but that's where you detail all this out to try to control the situation as much as you can before you turn it over to first responders who have their own set of protocols and are going to take over the scene at that point. let's see. Yeah, so that covers that. Again, poster 84, an emergency response card. We'll send these to you guys so you'll have them to build out, but probably a good point to hit any questions that we have missed, TJ.
Absolutely. And we do have several. There's plenty of time if folks want to keep adding more questions. Again, Will is answering them in the chat and we can address some live here. So you can see on screen, we've got a few kind of queued up for discussion points, but there are a number that have come in through the chat. So let's start addressing some of those. So first off, there's a question about the pandemic, right? Should a pandemic and the sort of environment that we're all in the moment cause enterprises to increase their, their level of risk, either that they're sensitive to or willing to tolerate, given, the state of the world and their mail security measures? So I don't know if this is a question best for Will or for Cody. I'll let you two decide. But how should organizations be responding to risk, especially given the current, COVID environment?
I'll hit that one real quick. Give Cody a break. They should be paying more attention to mail right now. As companies are doing more and more work remote, you see a lot of C-suite individuals or high priority or high risk that are no longer walking into the facility, yet the headquarters is still taking in mail and then transferring it to the house, into the home. So instead of it being everybody's in one location, everything's safe, now it's spread across the everybody's footprint. So it should be taken more seriously in especially times of COVID, because mail is being relied on so heavily. And when you stress logistical train like mail, you end up with gaps in security, and with areas that already have some gaps in it, it's not the best idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Again, if there are follow-ups, please feel free to submit those. Cody, this one will be for you. Are the transfer route and the screening, area or screening actions, are those considered the most dangerous steps in the process? Is that where security teams need to focus the most? How would you, assess the level of risk within the process and where we're the most vulnerable?
So, this is my personal opinion on this, because the risk, it varies at different times, depending on the threat and how it's constructed and what it's intended to do and all these types of things. And I'll, Will can provide a follow-up to this if he wants to, but for me, if a mail piece has gone through the mail stream, it's gone through processing facilities, if it's gone through equipment, machines, trucks, it's been delivered inside your facility, I'm not as concerned about something necessarily happening from the point of reception to your screening room. Now, that's not saying you couldn't be exposed to something, right? But I'm talking about, like, if you're looking at explosives or things that are designed to initiate once they're open, right? It's gone through a beating to get where it's at. So I wouldn't be as concerned with that. The biggest threat is opening these things, right? So some organizations open the mail for their executives. So it could be in the screening room when you are opening mail. That could be the point in time where you're exposed to the most risk. But, in terms of just moving it through a facility, if you think about your route and just kind of avoid people and infrastructure that are sensitive, I'm not as concerned about things that have already worked their way through the process. Now, if you have that random mail piece that gets dropped off on a receptionist desk up front, you have no idea where it came from, it's got postage that hasn't been canceled, things like that, right? The hair on the back of my neck standing up. But that's just kind of my opinion on that. It's more along the lines of anything that's visible, if you have things that you're being exposed to directly and you can visibly see those if they're leaking and things of that nature. But in terms of like IEDs and that type of stuff, I'm, place devices, yes, but something that's gone through the mail stream, less level of threat in my book, comparatively speaking. Will, what do you think? What do you think on that?
That's dead on. The only thing that I would add is, if you're going to look for transfer points, that's not going to be your high risk. It's going to be where the most amount of people are exposed to mail or anything that's just sitting there. So if you have an open, area that's you can move away from other people and leave it out of the way, that's great. But try to avoid congregations. And I know it's a hard thing to say right now with COVID, but when things go back to being normal, and you don't want to be leaving everything next to, say, the break area. It's just thinking things through.
Yep.
So we have a question that came in that's very timely. If folks have heard the news from overseas and those joining us from Europe, the Netherlands has received a number of these white powder events over the last few weeks. I think my last count was 19. I don't know if it's climbed since then, 19 of these incidents about white powder. And so this question addresses that specifically. A policy on evacuations with white powder events. Apparently this policy where if if the event is, or if the parcel is still closed, then there's no need for an evacuation, seal the room and deal with that. If it's open, that's when evacuation would occur. So, Will, maybe this one's for you. How do you, feel about best practices for when to trigger an evacuation in a white powder event?
First off, that's a fantastic reason to have an SOP, because that's a really hard time to come up and try to make that decision. Honestly, the best answer is not necessarily something that's going to sound nice and pretty. So whoever's open has been exposed should at that point be segregated and separated from everybody else that's in the area. Yes, evacuate. It's not going to jump up and bite anybody. But the reality is, statistically speaking, it's going to be a benign powder. It's not going to be something that's going to actually affect change in anybody. But that individual or individuals that were exposed needs to essentially become quarantined in themselves. Tell first responders to get there and figure out what exactly the powder is and clear the scene. Because if you have somebody that's been exposed, just walking around and meandering, like Cody mentioned earlier, walk through the office, asking people if you think it's bad, if there's white powder all over them, that's going to expose everybody else in the office. So yes, evacuate the individuals that were not exposed. Those that are, perhaps put them 2, 3, 4 rooms down and leave them segregated. Keep talking to them, but that's something you have to think about and how your company would handle that particular problem.
It's an interesting and important kind of distinction between quarantine and evacuation, right? All kind of comes down to level of exposure.
Yes.
All right. So there are a number of questions here about the mail facility and kind of, structural reinforcements or, construction type plans. And Will, I see you've addressed some of these in the chat already. So why don't we lump these all into one about, facility structural requirements, safety protocols, and Will, I guess for either of you, how do you want to speak on that topic?
Let me run this one down first. Cody did a very, very good job of explaining it, what you should do when you lay things out. 2 questions came in that brought up, shouldn't we have the plans already in place? Shouldn't the building be suited to deal with putting a mail room that's going to be high threat? It should, but it's almost always an afterthought. We have several Fortune 5 companies we talked to that the mailroom was absolutely an afterthought. So when you do this, you don't necessarily have to have 100% of the solution. You have to have the best little common sense answer that you can do with what you provided. So like Cody mentioned, you don't want it near servers. You don't want to be putting anything near infrastructure that you need to protect. Well, there's also parts of the building that are effectively helpful if you have a blast. Exposure or a blowout wall or exposure to a blowout window, room that faces outside, maybe into an alleyway that nobody's ever in. So if something does happen, it's going to vent out that window or vent out that wall, and the rest of the facility is going to be clearly protected. Avoiding things like elevator shafts, HVAC, those are the obvious ones. But there's something you can do in structure by taking a look at the facility which you've been given, and then make that work for your own tools. Now, none of them are going to be the same, but there's a lot of things you can do. You can't go off site, move it to a van out in the parking lot. If you've identified a risk as being that high, screen it in something that's temporary until the threat is either reduced or you can address that threat inside the building or the facility that you're in. There's 1,000 ways to get around problems, and it's all about how you solve those and go after it. Cody, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think it's spot on. I mean, it's unless you bring an expert like Will in to talk about, blast radius. I mean, there's so much that goes into a particular device and threat that it's hard to accommodate all of it, right? But we're looking at what are the most common things. What are you going to look like? What's your threat level? How does your risk assessment look? And you try to accommodate things as best as you can, in regards to the threats you're most likely to be exposed to. So that's just something to think about.
And there's temporary fixes for almost everything, right? So if you're a company, if you're worried about it and you have a legitimate threat, bomb blankets are not that expensive. You can bunker things. If you're worried about it, there's ways to maintain. Now, and it's going to be a couple things. Cody brought it up. If you set this up properly, when somebody like me shows up who's giggling because I'm about to fire off a tool in your mailroom, you can drive my actions to not be that violent. If you show up and you've already captured all this information, it's bunkered, you've got it in a someplace safe, it's not going to jump up and get anybody. That's a different tool selection for a first responder. It's the difference between somebody using a jaws of life to get you out of a car or just popping the door open. How the situation, the scenario is placed in front of somebody trying to make a decision is how they go with it. So it's long-winded.
It comes down to preparation and sort of understanding of the scenario. So a number of questions here about the USPS and their level of screening. And again, Will, I know you've addressed a few of these in the chat.
Cody, that's your world.
Yeah. So Cody, as a postal inspector, that's, obviously a different role than, somebody who works for the Postal Service. But I
Sure.
understand you can speak a little more authoritatively on what level of screening you can rely on already having been done before mail arrives at your door.
Yeah. The generic response is don't count on any screening to be done, right? And not knowing what Will answer, but he's very
That's
familiar
pretty
with the
much what I
topic.
said.
Yeah. So there's minimal screening. So law enforcement in general, including the Postal Inspection Service, very reactive because there's the volume. There's no way to screen billions of pieces of mail that come through every day effectively for every type of threat out there. There are things that the Postal Service does internally that are more limited and isolated in nature. Think about biologicals and particular ones at that. But when we're talking about large scale screening for the different threats that you may be exposed to, there's the burden falls on you as an organization. That's the way I would put it. If nobody cares about your safety more than you do, so take those steps that you need to just to make sure and take it seriously, because it is kind of the big it is that back door where that mail comes in. It's just left wide open most often, and it doesn't take but one incident to if it's a legitimate threat, the downside is it could be devastating. Just hoaxes alone, if they can be prevented, can cost you a lot of, or can save you a lot of money and bad media attention and those types of things. So yes, Postal Service does a little bit. It's not enough, and they can't physically do enough. So the burden falls on you.
Yeah, understood. There is a question here that I think is also very timely about PPE. What would you recommend for mailroom employees or anyone, in a similar environment to be using? Both, I'm going to add this in my own right for, current COVID environment and before or after COVID environment. What
Sure.
kind of protection should mailroom employees be taking for their own health and safety?
Well, pre-COVID, very few people were doing anything, and now is the time to implement these things if you don't have them, because it's easier sell, right? Wearing gloves and masks and things like that are easier. The recommendation in a perfect world, I would say at a minimum, have some sort of iPro, wear nitrile gloves, wear a proper mask that's going to do some good. Now, outside of even pandemic and all this kinds of things, mail is disgusting. It's gross, right? It's just filthy. It comes, if you work with it at any amount of time, I mean, your hands you're dirty, your clothes are dirty. So just that alone should encourage people to wear, gloves at a minimum. But if you can get gloves and a mask and some iPro, that's like the idea. You would be better off than 99% of organizations out there. If not, at least gloves and a mask, I think you could probably sell those at this point, and you should be all right. Will?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is some form of barrier for your clothes. If you have somebody that, like a smock, like think back to shop class or something, right? You had to wear those clothes for the rest of the day after you went and cut 2x4s. So just something as simple as that, because if it comes down to an exposure, they're going to take the outer layer of clothing of you off. So if the outer layer of clothing is something you can doff quickly and get off of, then you're going to be much more comfortable than standing in a parking lot losing that first layer. So, and it's just something you toss on and off. It's going to get dirty, but it's something that if you get exposed, you can remove it and be better off than you were.
Excellent. There's a question here about security clearance for UPS and FedEx employees. I'm not sure I understand exactly the intent of the question, so if I misinterpret this, please feel free to type it again. But can you talk about how, if you mentioned, for example, Cody, a vendor that you trust sending a pallet of staplers or something that we expect, that might not warrant a level of scrutiny. So can that be extended to everything that comes through UPS and FedEx? Or if not, where do you draw the line on how much you can trust vendors like that for their access into your facility?
Well, anytime we're looking at these things, we look at current trends and historical data, right? So what have we seen in the past and what are we seeing now? And the reality is most overwhelming majority of threats are anonymous in nature. People, they don't want to get caught, right? So they're going to take advantage of like the USPS, the blue collection boxes, right? USPS has standards on those in terms of weight and size, less than 10 ounces, half an inch thick. So what that does is it forces people to use smaller threats. And typically that's white powders and liquids and things of that nature that can fit inside these types of things. They're a lot less likely. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it has, and I've worked cases like this, but very rarely does someone go in to a facility, take a package in there at the risk of being on camera, present a method of payment that maybe identifies themselves and sends this thing through the mail stream in a fashion that there's a direct link back to that person. It's much easier to track somebody down and find them if they've done that, as opposed to somebody dropping off a letter in a collection box. Now, we're not saying that, if I'm not quite sure on the question, but if they're talking about an employee working for a carrier injecting or introducing something into this mail stream, I don't know that I've ever seen that happen, and I may be off. I don't know that I've ever seen a point of compromise like that. It's typically somebody dropping it in, and the vendor, the carrier, just happens to be the one conveying that threat. But Will may have some data on that.
The last couple of years. So the question is more over if you're working overseas, you work for UPS or USPS, do you have a clearance? And the answer is no. My son works for UPS and makes great money, nowhere near a clearance. And I asked him that direct question, and there's nothing for it. Now, to the rest of it, what Cody was talking about, it does happen. A lot of drugs get pushed through. UPS just got 13 people indicted earlier this year. They were catching packages halfway through, putting drugs inside of it, and then letting them carry on, or just putting them in themselves. And racketeering, they all got caught. But those were aimed towards their people they wanted to have it, not to general random threats. Or random. Most often when the drugs show up, if somebody wants them, or they get reported because it's the wrong address. The FBI received about 2 pounds of cocaine earlier this year in their Louisiana office. Just wrong address. It was meant for another room in the building. So things like that happen a lot.
No, and I specifically worked narcotics for a while, and you're right. You will see that the guy, they'll have these shipped through the mail. They'll use a unknown party's address as the delivery point to try to create that separation, and then they'll try to get it after it's been delivered before the actual resident or whoever lives there or works there grabs these things. And that's where you see the incident, like Will's talking about, where somebody gets their mail and they open it up and there's a pound of meth in there, and they're like, oh my gosh, so that does happen, but it's not as common. But people introducing drugs into the organization themselves, an employee, that does happen. That is a lot more common. That's increasing as we speak. So a little bit different scenario there, though.
So there's a question here about food packages coming in large volume, and if that's a complicating factor, if there's a facility that handles that sort of delivery, does that ring any bells for either of you of best practices for screening and scanning packages that might contain food?
No, don't. So here's a couple things that'll come up with that. One is if you're already using an X-ray that has discriminatory capabilities on it, it's going to throw it sideways, because really, yes, it's organic. And it's going to tell you that, but it's going to give you all sorts of crazy responses. The second thing is, a lot of people they think X-raying something's going to make it hazardous or unsafe. X-raying or using any scanning equipment on food is not going to make it inedible or make it dangerous for anybody consuming it. I've heard that one a couple times, and it's not a threat. But outside of doing regular screening procedures on packages like that, there's nothing really outside of that. If you're looking for other threats, there's some detection capability you can do, but there's something that optically would be able to pick up. It'd be a swipe test or a pH test.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That that kind of lends well into a few other questions here we have specifically about technology. Cody, you would mention introducing this at a certain level of SOP, maybe a high risk facility. This is where you would introduce technology into your screening process. There is a question here asking for suggestions for what types of equipment would be used for screening and scanning. Obviously, there are a number of options. We have our own. Will demoed our own earlier today, but for the two of you, what other types of technology are there? What kind of recommendations would you have for an organization considering this?
Cody, what you got, man?
I would say that, I'm probably biased, right? But the Mailsecur device, you need to look at what your threat is and what you're potentially going to be exposed to, right? What's coming in that needs to be screened, and what kind of technology can accommodate that. We pitch technologies and solutions a lot of times that address smaller powders, liquids, contraband, things of that nature, because that's what we're seeing most often, and that's where you're seeing the most major disruptions. I don't recall Will talking about this today or earlier, but when you look at even recent incidents like with Subway having a location dumped because of a white powder hoax, right? Something small that can come in, causes major disruptions. What can you do to catch those types of things? And if it's something where, visual and tactile and chain of custody is not enough, detecting small amounts of threats that can easily be introduced into these anonymous drop-off points, to me, that would be ideal. So when you're searching for something like that, look at what you're going to be potentially exposed to, what type of risk what does that look like on the back end, and then how is that going to get into your organization, and what can you use to address it? And that's kind of how I look at it when you're going through the assessment phase. And it's kind of a methodical approach to kind of to land on. Sometimes it's a combination of technology, right, to get your best solution, and that's you got to work through that assessment to get there.
Yeah, it's a lot like an algebra. You're trying to solve for X, which is never really fun because math sucks. But the technology, like Cody said, it's whatever's appropriate for your requirements. There is a lot of places out there. We work with many of these companies that have run off and they've got X-ray. X-ray is fantastic. I'm a huge proponent of it. It works really well. It also is essentially a hammer. It does a job. It does one job very well. And if you need to start doing things that are a little less like a hammer, and they don't really have the ability to back down from that. A lot of what the best thing to do, though, is what Cody mentioned, and I tend to harp on this earlier, is change detection is something that human beings are fantastic at doing. And if you look at most of the incidents after something's happened, there's almost always somebody standing there saying, yeah, that felt weird. That thing looked different than it did last week. I knew something was wrong. And that's before the incident happened. So the technology is fantastic. We have our product. We support it. We have our product. We combined with other products to provide the best possible answer. But I would say lean into human beings. We're not going anywhere. And it's the best thing out there, at least to begin the screening process with.
That answer kind of takes us straight into the last two questions we have here. This one that just came in a minute ago, how to, basically inform your employees or, how to overcome, the resistance, I suppose, and get them to comply with safety requirements. I imagine the answer there is training. Cody, we had talked about this previously, educating your people, right, and training them to understand the importance of some of the safety requirements. But the reason I mentioned here is there's also a question from our demo earlier with Will about what type of technology our system uses and how that one can kind of compare against things like X-ray. Again, you answered in the chat that it's millimeter wave scanner as opposed to X-ray, but is there anything else to talk about on that type of technology and what kind of how that works and what it can cover and that sort of thing?
Well, let me get after the first question, then Cody will. I think there's be two answers to the first question. So, my background is military. I did 25 years in the Army on the bomb squad. That does not mean that I would probably have the right answer for how do you overcome an irresistible force. Cody, that would probably be you on the best way to handle that.
Your answer would probably be more entertaining, but if you're talking about just internal employees in general, and you're introducing mail screening in your organization, and they're like, hey, that's a violation of my privacy and these types of things. Well, what I've been seeing lately is a lot of organizations allow employees to send mail, personal mail to their work address, just as a convenience. It's kind of a perk, right? So if they don't want to do that, if they don't want their stuff screened, then they can have it sent home. That's an easy solution. But the biggest selling point is talking about highlighting the things that have been going on, because there's enough of it going on where people are getting exposed and shutdowns and all this. Working it at the angle of, hey, we're out to protect you, right? This is a good thing. We want to deter people from sending threats into our organization. Those types of things. If you're talking about employees who are doing the screening themselves, right? It's an additional burden. Again, it's kind of the same methodology, but I think having them go through like tabletop exercises of a legitimate threat and having somebody organize that to where just take an incident that's happened recently that's been on the news, look at the details of that. And odds are your people aren't very familiar with it, and just sit them down, all the involved parties from the mail screener up to the global security director or whoever that looks like, and walk through that scenario. Hey, if you were exposed to this, here's the details and the particulars of this package. What would you do? They're like, If they don't know, right, they have no idea, then it's like, that's a good point to say, hey, we want to build some things out that help you deal with these types of scenarios. And we're going to introduce these into the organization. So it's to make your job easier, help you do things that keep you safe and keep everybody else safe. And I find that you can get a little bit more buy-in approaching it that way.
Excellent. So if there are any other questions, feel free to submit those now. Gentlemen, I feel like we've been fairly thorough, so thank you for all your help and all these answers, the valuable information. Is there any other thing in recap before we start to wrap up here, for last kind of thoughts on some of these questions?
I think we've covered it, Will. Unless you have anything, I appreciate everybody's time for hanging in there. And if you have anything that you want addressed privately, feel free to reach out and we'll provide that contact info to you. So feel free anytime.
The SOP process that we typically go through is usually as much longer, more thorough, as Cody mentioned. This is just kind of an introduction. So if you're interested in that, please do let us know. We're happy to help you with that. And if you missed the demo earlier in the webinar today, we're happy to schedule some of those privately as well. Will can walk through, what our system can handle and how to address some of these threats. So if there are no other questions, then thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And we'll sign off and say goodnight. So thank you very much and stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.